European settlers watched their livestock freeze to death by the hundreds, while Native American animals thrived in the exact same brutal winters, sometimes without any shelter at all. The difference wasn't luck. It was a technique so counterintuitive that modern ranchers are only now rediscovering it. Here's the thing most people get wrong about Native Americans and livestock. They didn't really have livestock. Not the way Europeans thought about it anyway. Dogs. That was the main animal. And these weren't pets lounging on sofas. These dogs hauled supplies, tracked game, and here's where it gets interesting, worked as living heating systems. But we'll get to that. The Pueblo peoples in the Southwest did raise turkeys, though not primarily for eating. They wanted the feathers. Sounds weird until you realize turkey feathers made incredible blankets and ceremonial clothing. The meat was almost a bonus. Now, some Pacific Northwest tribes bred small dogs specifically for their wool-like fur. They sheared these dogs like sheep. I had to read that twice myself. Sheared like sheep. These weren't random mutts either. They were carefully bred over generations. Then the Spanish showed up in the 1500s with horses, and everything changed. Suddenly, Plains tribes weren't just keeping a few dogs warm. By the 1800s, a single family might own 50 to 200 horses. That's not a pet situation anymore. That's a full-scale winter survival operation. And let's not forget the Great Lakes tribes who kept semi-domesticated flocks of ducks and geese near winter camps. Smart move, waterfowl are surprisingly cold-hardy, and they provided eggs, meat, and down feathers. So when we talk about Native Americans keeping animals alive through brutal winters, we're talking about a wild variety. Dogs bred for specific purposes, turkeys managed for feathers, wool dogs that got haircuts, and eventually massive horse herds that required techniques Europeans simply didn't possess. The question is, where did they actually keep all these animals when temperatures dropped to deadly levels? Turns out, picking the right spot mattered more than building the fanciest shelter. Location. It always comes back to location. Native Americans didn't just stumble onto winter camping spots, they scouted them months ahead, sometimes a full year before bringing a single horse. The criteria? Pretty specific. South-facing hillsides caught more sun. Canyon walls blocked those brutal north winds. Dense tree lines acted like natural fences against blizzards. River bottoms were gold. Not for water, that freezes anyway. For temperature. A valley floor sits 10 to 15 degrees warmer than an exposed hilltop. Doesn't sound like much until you realize that's the difference between your horse surviving and your horse becoming a frozen statue. The Lakota had this figured out brilliantly. They picked spots where wind patterns naturally swept snow away from grazing areas instead of piling it up. Think about that. They weren't just finding shelter. They were finding places where their horses could still eat. Cottonwood groves, double winters, the trees blocked wind. But here's the clever part. Those same trees would later become emergency food. We'll get to that. Elders studied weather patterns for decades, not casually, obsessively, because one bad call on campsite selection could kill half your horses in a single storm. I've seen people spend less time choosing a house. And then there were the hot springs. Natural hot springs scattered across the northern territories became sacred gathering spots. Makes sense, right? Warm water stays warm. Ground nearby stays unfrozen. Animals could drink without cracking through ice. Some tribes returned to the same winter valleys for generations. These spots earned names. They were inherited like property. But finding the perfect spot only solved half the problem. The animals still needed actual shelter when temperatures dropped to genuinely deadly levels. Shelter wasn't optional. It was life or death. Dogs had the easiest arrangement. They slept inside, right there with the family, curled up near the fire, stealing warmth like furry little freeloaders. But honestly, nobody complained. Those dogs earned their spot by adding body heat to the lodge. Fair trade. Horses were a different problem entirely. You can't exactly invite 50 horses into your teepee. Trust me, someone tried. Didn't end well, so tribes got creative. The Navajo built brush corrals with juniper walls thick enough to stop freezing desert winds cold. These weren't flimsy fences. We're talking dense, interlocking branches stacked until they formed actual walls. Takes hours to build. Saves horses for years. The Nez Perce took a smarter approach. They found canyon walls that already did half the work, then built lean-to shelters against them. Poles, brush, whatever they could stack. These structures protected 20 horses at once from blizzard conditions. Here's something nobody mentions enough. Snow itself became building material. Tribes packed snow into walls 8 feet high. Sounds crazy until you remember that snow is actually an insulator. Igloos work on the same principle. Those snow barriers blocked wind while trapping whatever warmth the animals generated. And old lodge covers? Nothing got wasted. When a teepee covering wore out for human use, it became an animal shelter. Draped over pole frames, these makeshift structures weren't pretty, but they kept horses alive. Plateau tribes went underground. They built pit houses where the earth itself stayed warmer than the frozen surface. Dogs sheltered in these insulated lower areas while blizzards raged above. Shelter solved the immediate problem, but animals still needed to eat something during those brutal months. Snow buried everything. Grass, gone. Shrubs, buried. Your horse is standing there looking at you like, now what? Plains tribes had an answer that sounds ridiculous until you understand the science. Cottonwood bark, not the rough outer stuff, the inner bark. That soft, moist layer right beneath the surface contains enough nutrients to keep a horse alive for weeks. We're talking emergency calories when literally nothing else exists. And here's what's wild. Horses figured this out themselves. Warriors noticed their animals pawing desperately at fallen cottonwood branches during blizzards. Not random chewing. Targeted survival behavior. The horses knew before the humans did. So tribes started hauling branches to camp. Sometimes riders traveled 20 miles through freezing conditions just to find good cottonwood groves. 20 miles. In snow to get tree bark. That's how valuable this knowledge was. The really clever part? Tribes guarded their best cottonwood stands like family heirlooms. These weren't just random trees, they were insurance policies. Mess with another tribe's cottonwood grove, and you were basically declaring war on their horses. Makes sense, right? Here's something archaeologists still use today. Horses eating cottonwood produce distinctive droppings. Different color, different texture. Scientists can dig up a site and immediately know winter camp, cottonwood feeding station. The evidence literally lasts centuries, but cottonwood had limits. One grove might sustain a herd for a few weeks, maybe a month if you stretched it. Then what? Tribes needed more strategies. And this is where dogs became something nobody expects. Not just companions, not just hunters, but actual heating equipment that kept children alive on nights when temperatures dropped so low that even fire wasn't enough. Dogs weren't pets. They were survival technology. Here's something most people don't realize. A single large dog produces roughly the same heat as a small space heater. Now imagine 4 of them. That's serious warmth. And tribes understood this centuries before anyone invented thermometers. On the coldest nights, families piled dogs around their children like furry insulation. Not because they were cute, because those kids might freeze to death otherwise. The dog slept, the kids survived, everybody won. But here's where it gets clever. Northern tribes almost never kept short-haired dogs. Think about that. You'd expect variety, right? Different breeds for different jobs? Nope. Almost universally thick coats, dense undercoats, fur you could lose your fingers in. This wasn't coincidence. This was selective breeding for survival. Tribes chose which dogs could breed based on coat quality, not looks. A handsome dog with thin fur? Sorry, buddy, you're not passing those genes along. A homely beast with ridiculous fluff? Welcome to the breeding program. I've seen working dogs in cold climates. Their undercoats are genuinely insane. Pull the top layer aside and there's another whole layer beneath, then another. It's like fur lasagna. And dogs had another advantage humans don't talk about. They ate garbage, bones too tough for human teeth. Dog food, scraps too rancid for people. Perfect. Gristle, cartilage, the weird bits nobody wanted. All of it converted into body heat that benefited the whole family. Dogs were basically little furnaces that ran on leftovers. Pueblo peoples took this further. During storms, they brought dogs into underground kivas where earth-insulated walls stayed above freezing naturally, but keeping animals warm was only half the battle. Getting them food during winter? That required something completely different. Strategic movement across hundreds of miles. Staying put during winter? That's a death sentence for animals. Nomadic tribes figured this out thousands of years ago. You don't fight the weather. You move away from it. The Crow people had this down to a science. Every fall, they drove their entire horse herds into the Bighorn Basin. Why there specifically? Mountain walls blocked Arctic winds like a giant shield. Temperatures inside the basin ran 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the open plains. Same latitude, completely different survival odds. But here's what made this tricky: timing. Get it wrong and you're caught in open country when a blizzard hits. I've seen modern ranchers lose cattle this exact way. One bad decision, 30 dead animals. So scouts watched everything: cloud formations, bird migrations, how elk were behaving, when certain grasses turned brown. These weren't superstitions. They were accumulated data from generations of people who paid attention because their lives depended on it. And the distances involved were genuinely impressive. Some tribes traveled 200 miles between summer and winter ranges. 200 miles, with horses, dogs, children, elderly relatives, and everything they owned, all timed around keeping animals alive. Pregnant mares got special treatment too. They moved to protected valleys weeks before everyone else. Makes sense, right? A mare giving birth during a blizzard isn't giving birth at all. She's dying. The best winter valleys had names. Families passed them down like inherited property. You didn't just know where to go. You knew exactly which canyon had the warmest air pockets, which slopes melted first in spring. Moving animals was only half the challenge, though. Once you reached winter camp, you still needed to feed them for months. That required serious planning and some creative food storage. Food storage wasn't glamorous, but it kept animals breathing. The Pueblo peoples treated corn stalks like gold. During fall harvest, they didn't burn the stalks or leave them rotting in fields. They bundled them tight, dried them in the sun, and stacked them against adobe walls. Come January, those dried stalks kept turkeys alive when nothing green existed for miles. Same principle, different animal, different tribe. Salmon fishing tribes in the Northwest had an interesting problem. They caught way more fish than humans could eat. The solution? Dry the ugliest, most oil-soaked pieces specifically for dogs. Fish that would make a person gag became canine survival rations. Nothing wasted. And here's where planning got almost obsessive. Families actually calculated how much food their animals would need, months ahead. If the summer hunt went poorly or the harvest looked thin, hard decisions followed. Some horses got traded away in fall. Better to own 8 well-fed horses than 12 starving ones by February. Pemmican scraps too rancid for human stomachs? Dog food. Bone marrow that had gone slightly off? Dog food. Tribes basically invented recycling before recycling was cool. The storage methods were clever too. Grass cut from early melting slopes got cached in bark-lined pits. Underground temperatures stayed just warm enough to prevent complete freezing, but cold enough to stop rotting. Natural refrigerators, basically. Some tribes even noted which grasses dried best, which ones kept nutritional value longest. This wasn't random. It was accumulated knowledge tested by centuries of trial and error. Mostly error, honestly. Dead animals taught harsh lessons, but even perfect food storage couldn't solve every problem. Sometimes survival came down to something simpler. Body heat, lots of it, packed together tight. 30 horses standing alone, cold. 30 horses packed tight into a corral? Basically, a living furnace. Tribes figured this out fast. Corrals weren't built roomy and comfortable. They were built snug, almost cramped, and that was completely intentional. Here's the math. A single horse generates about the same heat as a small wood stove. Now multiply that by 30 animals pressed flank to flank. The temperature in the center of that group could run 20 degrees warmer than the outside air. Snow literally melted underneath them. Dogs worked the same way. Nobody kept one dog tied up alone in the cold. Dogs stayed in packs, curled together in furry piles that looked like one giant breathing organism. Smart design by nature, smarter use by humans, but it gets more interesting. Handlers actually arranged horses strategically. The biggest, healthiest animals got positioned on the windward side. They became living walls for the weaker ones. Pregnant mares, young colts, skinny horses recovering from illness, all tucked into the protected center. Was this random kindness? Nope, pure economics. Losing a breeding mare cost the equivalent of losing a small fortune. Newborn animals got VIP treatment. A foal born during a January blizzard might spend its first week inside a teepee, right there with the family, humans complaining about the smell, while the baby horse learned to regulate its own temperature. My grandmother's house smelled like wet dog every winter. This was probably worse. The most valuable horses, the ones warriors depended on, sometimes got wrapped in buffalo robes during extreme cold. Like tucking in a very large, very expensive child. Body heat kept animals alive. But sometimes nature buried everything under 3 feet of snow. Then what? Snow buried everything. 3 feet deep. Grass completely gone. Now what? Horses actually know how to handle this. They paw through snow to reach grass underneath. Their hooves work like shovels. But here's the thing. They can only dig through about 18 inches before they give up. Anything deeper? They stand there confused. So tribes stepped in. The Blackfeet had a trick that sounds crazy until you think about it. Fire. They'd light controlled burns on snow-covered grazing areas. The heat melted patches down to bare ground. Horses rushed in before new snow could fall. Risky? Sure, but watching your herd starve was riskier. Children got put to work too, not chopping wood or hunting, scraping snow for hours, using wooden tools their fathers carved specifically for this job. Not glamorous work, but a 10-year-old clearing a feeding patch might save 3 horses. That's real responsibility. Dogs handled their own version of snow excavation. Families buried bones and meat scraps in fall. Come January, dogs dug like maniacs to find them. No training required. Hunger is a fantastic motivator. Then there's the Chinook winds, warm spells that roll down from the mountains and melt everything overnight. Tribes watched for these like stockbrokers watching the market. When a Chinook hit, move the horses immediately. That exposed grass might only last 2 days before the next storm buried it again. Here's what most people miss, though. Grass under snow isn't dead. It stays green, protected. The snow acts like insulation, keeping the ground warmer than the freezing air above. Getting to that grass was the hard part. Sometimes the snow melted, sometimes tribes cleared it by hand, and sometimes nothing worked. Animals died anyway. Even with all these tricks, animals still died. That's the part nobody wants to talk about. Tribes expected to lose 10 to 20% of their horses in a brutal winter. Not hoped, expected. They planned for it the way we budget for car repairs. Unpleasant, but inevitable. Here's where it gets surprisingly practical. Before winter even started, families made hard decisions. That old mare who struggled last February, she's not getting another chance to drain precious resources. Weak animals were butchered in fall. Sounds harsh, but feeding an animal that probably won't survive anyway, that's just slow starvation for the whole herd. Dogs had it easier, honestly. They breed fast. One devastating winter might wipe out half your pack. By summer, puppies everywhere. Problem solved. Horses took years to replace, which brings us to spring trading gatherings. These weren't just social events. They were livestock auctions without the annoying auctioneers. Tribes who lost horses traded buffalo robes, beadwork, whatever they had. Tribes with surplus animals walked away rich. The whole economy revolved around post-winter recovery. And those horses that did survive the worst winters, they became legends. Seriously. A stallion that made it through the blizzard of whatever year got bred constantly. His offspring inherited whatever genetic magic kept him standing when others froze. Natural selection working in real time. But here's what matters most. Tribes never viewed winter losses as failures. A 20% death rate didn't mean they did something wrong. It meant winter did what winter does. They adjusted, learned, tried different valleys next year. Perfection was never the goal. Survival was. And survival meant accepting that some battles you lose, no matter how smart you play them. That's not failure. That's wisdom.